and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, welcome to the one and only Rock and Wrestling Podcast. Glorious, no, I won't give in till I'm victorious, and I will defend. From far and wide and light years away, cast from the shadows and I light my way. You think you know me? I'm just a sexy boy. Oh, I'm not your boy toy. I'm just a sexy. I am a real American. Fight for the rights of every man. Without further ado, from parts unknown, your host with the most, Nick. I am a real American. Fight for the rights of
All right, we're back this week with another edition of the Rock and Wrestling Podcast. I got a great guest today, the phenomenal Matt Koon of Wide Ended, also Conrad's main music guy on Something to Wrestle With, What Happened When Monday, and 83 Weeks. I sat down with Matt last week, and we talked just a couple of music nerds talking about guitar, what guitars we like to play, recording, also pro wrestling, everything along those was off limits. This was one of the better interviews. I think personally it's the best interview to date that I've had on the podcast because we just sat around, took about 45, 50 minutes, and we just talked about all kinds of topics, rock and wrestling. It was great. This is kind of what I envisioned that I would have on this podcast, was just guys, shooting the shit. That's kind of what I like. That's what I like to do when I get along with my buddies, grab a couple beers, shoot the shit, have a good time. And this was just a couple guys shooting back and forth, and I think it's probably the best interview. You're going to really enjoy it. Matt talks all about his music, talks about all the podcast work he does. And if you haven't checked out his podcast yet, you need to do it. It's called Wide Ended with Robbie E. It's phenomenal stuff. Last week, the Marty Jannetty episode, you probably heard. A little plug for us, as I was a sponsor for that episode. It was really good. As this drops today, so does Wide Ended. It always comes out on Wednesdays. It's with Jimmy Jacobs. They've had Justin Credible. They've had Muhammad Hassan. They've had Cherry, if you remember who she is. Glacier. All really good stuff. And we get all into some of those guests and how that concept came to be, because it's a really fascinating concept that Robbie E came up with. He approached Matt about it, and they came together. So we had that. It's all in the discussion. So I'm really looking forward to you guys hearing that. It's one of the longer interviews I've done, but like I said, just a couple of guys talking back and forth, and it's really cool. It's what I envisioned for this podcast. Matt's a really cool dude. Give him a follow on Twitter at Matt Koon Music. Definitely do that, and I'll be seeing Matt out there at Starrcast. So, a couple things I want to wrap up from last week's episode with Conrad. Got a lot of really good feedback on Conrad. If you're new to the podcast, I thank you for listening. I thank, once again, Matt and Robbie for allowing me to sponsor that episode and pick up a lot of new listeners. So if you're new to the podcast, welcome. Interact with me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at Nick's R&W Podcast. That's the official Rock and Wrestling Podcast Twitter. Go on Facebook at Nick's Rock and Wrestling Podcast. You can find it as well as Instagram Rock and Wrestling Podcast, on YouTube. And now, big announcement, I'm also available on Google Play, Stitcher, iTunes Radio, and coming soon, Podbean and other platforms to find your podcast. So podcast is growing, so you can now find on Google Play if you're an Android user, as well as Stitcher and iTunes Radio, all available, as well as the original place on iTunes and SoundCloud. You can find all of it right there. So now, much widespread. So if you're new to the podcast and you don't necessarily have iTunes, you can go on Google Play, Stitcher, iTunes Radio, all of that. As well, if you're new to the podcast, make sure you run over to patreon.com. It's patreon.com/RNW podcast. I'm kind of sandbagging a little bit there off what happened when Monday. Got 3 different levels. Go out, check it out, support the podcast any way you can. As well, go over to prowrestlingtees.com/ Rock and Wrestling Podcast store. You can get your official Rock and Wrestling Podcast t-shirts. Gonna have some more designs coming up there in the coming weeks for the summer months. So go over there, support, and as well, when you find the podcast on iTunes, give it a review. If you give the podcast a review, you shoot me on an inbox, on whether it's on Facebook, Twitter, the email, rockandwrestlingpodcast@gmail, screenshot your review. I will send you a free t-shirt. So make sure you go over, give it a 5-star review, write a little something about the podcast, and you get a free t-shirt courtesy of me. So make sure you do that. Go to patreon.com, give it a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, iTunes Radio, all available all across the board. Before we get into the interview with Matt Koon, just want to give you kind of a little schedule recap that we're going to go on. Today, Wednesday, June 6th, you're getting Matt Koon. Tomorrow, Thursday, June 7th, you get a little bonus episode with Dr. Tom Pritchard. Sat down with him last week. Can't wait for you guys to hear that. Another really long interview that I've been getting some longer interviews, so that's good. So that'll be a little bonus episode I'm throwing out there for you, especially for all the new listeners. I figured, a 2-week week with 2 episodes would be perfect for being on Google Play and Stitcher and iTunes Radio. So throwing that out there as well. Next week will be Braden Blackener, I believe is his name. Sorry, Braden, if I screwed that up. He'll be on. He's the local Bay Area musician here in Northern California. We're going to talk all about, he's got a music festival he's putting on. He's a big wrestling fan as too. So we're going to, once again, like I said, with this podcast I envision guys coming on and us just shooting the shit. So we're going to shoot the shit. The following week, Wednesday, June 20th, you're going to have kind of a double shot here. You're going to get former WCW ring announcer David Penzer as the featured guest, and then a little Money in the Bank post-show analysis. So going to be having my brother CK coming on the podcast, so we're going to talk all about the Money in the Bank pay-per-view. Actually, we're going to record it right after the Money in the Bank pay-per-view ends, so we can kind of get some reaction to it right away. So that'll be June 20th, David Penzer and a Money in the Bank review. And then finally, Wednesday, June 27th, is going to be Eric from the band Void Vader, LA heavy metal band. There's going to be on there. As well as that, going to have a special treat for the 20-year anniversary of the Hell in the Cell match between Mankind and The Undertaker. Going to have my boy Uncle Mike coming on, and we're going to do something fun with that. And then finally, there's going to be a July 4th episode. Got something in the works, and then July 11th will be AJ Kirsch. So got the next month really solid planned out. Just wanted to give you. So I'm going to recap one more time. Today you're getting Matt Koon. Tomorrow, Dr. Tom Pritchard. Next week is Braden. June 20th, David Penzer and a Money in the Bank review. June 27th, Eric from Void Vader. Going to have something on July 4th. Haven't nailed it down quite yet. Don't want to reveal it. And then July 11th will be AJ Kirsch. So, really good stuff going on. Remember, I'm going to be out at Starrcast Labor Day weekend for All In and Starrcast. I'm going to be on Podcast Row. Come say hi. Going to be there all weekend long. Really, really looking forward to it. As well, I'll be in October at the Aftershock Festival here at Discovery Park in Sacramento, California. Come say hi. Make sure you get your tickets now. Single day tickets are on sale, as well as weekend passes, VIP. Go over to Aftershock.com and make sure you get your tickets right now as well. I'll see you in Chicago for Starrcast. I'll be on Podcast Row along with many other great podcasts, and we will be rocking and rolling for All In weekend. So, coming up on the other side, Matt Koon. All right, I am here with Matt Koon, the musical genius behind What Happened When, 83 Weeks, Something to Wrestle With, also why it ended with Robbie E-Man. I appreciate you taking the time out to join me here.
Oh, no, thanks for having me, man. It's an honor. It's kind of weird for me as a fan to be interviewed by another fan, but I guess I'm a little bit in the business now, so I'll try to get used to it.
Yeah, I mean, you do a really good job, the music and everything. That was one of the things when I started talking to Conrad. I'm like, who does the music for the podcast? Because I'm like, this is really good stuff, and it's not easy stuff either. When like the What Happened When jingle, that's not easy to with.
Well, with what happened when, I mean, I'm pretty proud of it. It took me a long time to get the lyrics right and the cadence right and the rhyming right. If you listen to that song, it's a parody of "We Didn't Start the Fire," and so the first thing I had to do is kind of ba ba da 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 da, and then rhyme inside each sentence, and then rhyme outside of each sentence, and then of course play the guitar and the bass and get the drum machine and all that going. But I'm pretty proud of that one actually.
Yeah, I was like, man, that's hard because I'm a musician myself, and it's hard enough writing just regular songs, but then when you got to kind of like, oh, I got to make this funny and jingly, it's even harder.
Oh yeah, but it's something I got used to doing, working on something to wrestle with Bruce Pritchard, where I would make up all kinds of funny stuff, and also on Tony Schiavone's show as well, like the song I did called "Fuck Dave Meltzer" that people seem to like, and I did "Bye Bye to the Z-Man" and a bunch of stuff. So it's something I'm getting used to. It's almost a perfect melding of my two big interests.
Yeah, it is really good, and that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. Is kind of like where your musical background started. Like when did you kind of first pick up the instruments, and maybe a lot of people don't know. Did you play in bands, or what? How exactly did you get going musically?
Well, that's a pretty good question. My parents are musicians, but they didn't teach me anything. I'm a group home kid from Southern California who saw someone play guitar, and I saw my parents play, but they never taught me. And I saw him play guitar, and he was a counselor at a group home. And I saw what he was doing with his fingers. I said, "What are those called?" He said, "Chords." I said, "Can you loan me your guitar and write down some chords for me?" And then he's like, "Cool." And then he gave that to me on a Friday, and on Monday I said, "I need more chords." So I was hooked right away. I played in a bunch of bands, nothing that did anything. I had an instrumental band in the maybe 15 years ago that was all shred guitar stuff. And then I started my real musical study then. I met a guy named Victor Wooten. Have you ever heard of Victor before?
I have not, no.
So Victor's like a 5-time Grammy winner. He plays with Bela Fleck and the Flecktones. He's on Rolling Stone magazine's list of greatest bass players of all time. He's number 10. And he was someone that through him, I got a lot of education from him and a lot of education through his brother Joseph, who plays keys for Steve Miller, and a lot of his friends who play in various bands. And then I opened up my own music school after teaching lessons for a while. And I've had my own music school with 150 students a week for the last, I'd say, 8 years. I've also played music in pits as far as orchestras. I was the musical director for American Idiot here in Richmond for a theater group doing it. So music is pretty much what I do all the time.
That's incredible because being a musician myself, being a full-time musician and making a career out of it is very difficult. So my hat's off to you because that's really, really incredible stuff.
And that's the cool thing about this wrestling thing was that I literally had all my recording equipment put away. It had been away for maybe a year or two. And Conrad tweeted something about, can someone find me this song? And it was an instrumental version of Akeem's theme. And so I tweeted him, not even having my equipment out, and I said, I can't find the song, but I can make you a sound-alike. And that's how I got involved in all this, was just music and recording and being creative, and it's really a perfect mix for me.
Yeah, that it really is because the state of, I would say, the music business is kind of similar to pro wrestling in that they've drastically changed in the last, even 10, 15 years. So the fact that you're kind of in both is kind of cool.
Well, I'll tell you what, it's the same thing. People say that it's different, and it is different in a lot of ways. But for me, it's been great. And I think for wrestlers like, I'm not comparing myself to these wrestlers, but people like Cody Rhodes or whoever, you can say, well, there's not as much, as big as a platform as there once was, or different ways to do it. But the cream rises to the top. Hard work pays off, and there's still no excuses. So even though there's not all the record stores anymore, even though you can download stuff for free, there's almost more of an opportunity to get seen and heard. 10 years ago, I would have never been seen by a Conrad Thompson, who would have led to everything else that I've done. So I'm saying it's probably good for the music business. It's been good for me, and hopefully it's good for the wrestling business.
Yeah, I think it is very good for both because it just allows for so many people to see where kind of that old school model, especially with bands where it was like you had to go out and really search and play in the right markets, whether it was LA or Chicago for a record company. So now you can put something on YouTube and be discovered the next day.
Absolutely. And at the same time, if you're a guy like Victor or you're a guy like some of the other people I know who are professional musicians, if you have an asshole in your band, you can replace him instantly. In talking to people, Charlie Parker, if you want to go back a long time, Charlie Parker would not have had a gig if there was Twitter around then, because someone would have said, hey man, I'm tired of dealing with this asshole, even though he's really good. And he would have found another Charlie Parker on YouTube. So I think it's good for a lot of people, as long as you have an open mind, and as a content creator, as long as you're willing to work harder than everybody else.
Yeah, you make a great point there that I never thought. Because I'm a huge 80s rock fan, and I think about, my God, how many different bands would there be if Twitter was around in 1984? Man, we're going to get rid of Axl. We don't like him.
Right, exactly. And at the same time, Vince Neil might have tweeted some shit that would have got him kicked, Motley Crue kicked off the airwaves forever. So there's probably two sides to that. But, at the same time, things would have been different, because I'll give you a great example. We're talking rock and wrestling, and guitar and, guitar playing. The first guy who started doing that percussive guitar technique, he might have never been heard. But then you see Andy McKee do it, and you see all these other guys do it, and now everybody's slapping their guitars and doing these harmonics and doing this tapping stuff. And maybe 20 years ago, no one would have seen that, and those techniques would have been kind of hidden.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's so many things I think about. You can go on, the guys that did my theme song, I scouted out and found them on YouTube and sent them an email and go, hey, would you guys be interested in doing some theme music? And they were like, sure, which 20 years ago you wouldn't have been able to.
And not to mention also, like, if you want to learn how to play a song or you want to learn how to play an instrument, all those resources are out there. I teach, like I said, 150 students a week, and I still have a good business doing that. But as a kid, I was not able to get lessons, so I didn't have those resources. But right now, if I want to learn how to play the guitar for Asuka's theme song, I haven't looked it up, but I'm 90% sure there's someone who's done it on YouTube, and I can find out how to do it.
Yeah, obviously I'm probably a lot younger. That's kind of how I learned to play, was looking stuff up, whether it be internet or tabs that weren't there, where compared to like Slash is my favorite guitar player, he's like, I had to learn by ear.
Yeah, definitely. Slash is, one of my favorite guitar players as well. I'm a Les Paul, Marshall guy. When I record, I use 57s against the grill. So I'm a big Slash guy, big Guns N' Roses guy. I can't believe you had Dizzy Reed on your show, man. That's awesome.
Yeah, he was really cool, man. If you haven't, check out his solo record, because that's what he came on and we talked and he really promoted, and it's just as good as the gun stuff. I mean, Slash is my favorite. I'm just like you. I'm a Les Paul guy. I use the Slash custom models, 57, man. For me, it's just got more thicker sound than those smaller neck Fenders or an Ibanez. It's just got more balls to it.
Yeah, and you got to have those. I'm doing a lot of, for instance, you talk about rock and wrestling. So as soon as we're done with this interview, I guess I can say it now because this won't come out, but I'll be recording Robbie E's new theme song for him to come out at House of Hardcore with his new gimmick. And also there's a documentary that Peter Ferrero is doing on X-Pac. And so I'm doing a lot of sound-alikes for him. So I've done like a 1-2-3 Kid song and a Ross type song, and I've done a DX song. I'm doing an NWO type song. So if I have a Les Paul and I have a Telly in the room, that's pretty much all I really need for guitar wise. I'll find the sounds I want between those two things.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've been a Les Paul guy since I've started playing. I mean, I've mostly done heavier rock, metal type stuff, and I'm like, this gets the job done. I don't need anything other than this.
Yeah, for me, you want, and I don't know how many wrestling fans out there playing music, but for me, I realized when I started taking gigs with other types of bands, I started as a rock guy. Now I've done a lot of jazz, I've done a lot of soul, I've done a lot of funk stuff. You have to read music. And the fact is, sometimes I've gone to a gig with my Les Paul and it just does not sound right if I'm playing with a swing band or I'm playing with a jazz band. So, even though the Les Paul is my guy, I don't think it fits all situations unless, you just want to sound like Slash all the time, which is not the worst case either.
No, it's not. So some of the other gigs that you do and you have to read music, I'm not formally trained in reading music. Did you just pick that up over time? Because you said you never really had lessons as a kid. Did you just pick that up over time?
Yeah, I did a lot of, even though I played in bands and had my most success maybe in my 20s, I did most of my learning in my 30s, and I'm still doing learning now. So I decided there was a time, especially as a rock guitar player, it's like, am I full of shit or can I actually play? That's a question you have to ask yourself. Most rock players like me, you stay in one position, you play a pentatonic scale, you rip it up and down. You don't really know the notes you're playing and how they relate to each chord that's going on. And so what I decided to do was really just focus on a lot of jazz, focus on reading music. I learned a lot by teaching. So now I can read bass clef and treble clef. I can do it for piano or guitar or bass. And, it's one of those things when you have students come in, and I have a lot of adult students, I have a lot of professional musicians who are students, and they're afraid of learning new skills. It's kind of bullshit because the only reason a kid says that they can't learn something, or only reason a kid can learn anything is because they don't say, I can't do it. Adults say, oh, it's too hard for me. But literally, if you wanted to start reading music today and you started just like reading a little easy piece of sheet music every day, you'd be reading well in like 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, well, you bring up a great point because I was, I'm playing in rock bands and everything, and I thought, I just want to sound like Slash or sound like Motley Crue. But then I went to take some lessons to pick up maybe different scales, and that's when I started getting into that theory and stuff. And at first, I was kind of hesitant, like, oh, I'm just a rock guy. I don't need to learn this. But then when you start learning blues and jazz and incorporating it, it makes you better overall.
Yeah, absolutely. I tell students all the time. I told some today. I said, because I now have a lot of high-level high school students. Some of the best in the state come from my little school. And, I tell them, I don't listen to jazz. I don't really even like jazz. But I play it and I learn it to make me a better player. And, blues won't really do it as far as that goes. But, jazz and other styles, classical, will help you with your theory. And if you think about the stuff I'm talking about, if I want to recreate a song or if I want to play a different version of a song, or, I sing the Tony Schiavone song, but I can't sing in that key. So how do I transpose it down? A lot of that music theory is helpful in rock. And I've never really known a situation where it's worse to know something than not know it. So I try to find out as much theory as I can on top of it.
Yeah, when I finally started getting it, my songwriting started to get better, and I started taking a different approach to things, going rehearsal and going, hey, let's try this chord or this, and this is how they go together. And the other guys were like, what's going on? I said, let me explain, starting to teach them a little bit so that it made the overall piece of music better.
Well, it's only important if you want to know why. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can play and you can rock an A chord to a D chord to an E chord and go back to A. And if you want to know why that works, then theory's for you, because if I'm just playing an A and a D and an E and I go back to A, I know when I hit that E chord that there's a note in it called a G sharp that wants nothing more than to go back to the A chord. And so we call that a 5, and we call that a cadence when you go from the 5 to the 1. Now, you can just play that E to the A and know it sounds good, or you can understand what that tension resolution is and apply it to different situations with different chords. And now you have a wider depth of understanding, and you can replicate what you want in more of a variety of ways.
Absolutely, man. A couple of music nerds here talking theory. I dig it.
Well, theory is important, but music cannot be constructed on a piece of paper. Music cannot be constructed, in a laboratory. You have to you don't have to understand the theory. But for me, I've always come from two places. Music can make me cry, and I can explain to you what scales you can use to make you cry. So a lot of people either have one or the other. I'm lucky that I'm an emotional, creative type that has the intellectual curiosity to want to know theory. And then I think it's kind of a perfect melding for a fucked up person and also a good musician.
Absolutely. Totally. Exactly. I mean, kind of like a wrestling match, drawing on storytelling and emotion. That's really what makes them both really work.
Exactly. And I can't tell you, it's a lot like music. I'm not a wrestler. I talk to wrestlers. When Dutch Mantel's going, I talk to Dutch Mantel every week. I talk to Robbie E. every week. I talk to different wrestlers on DMs every week. But I can't tell you those little things that make you a match good, because I'm not a musician. I'm not inside of it. But I can have a fan's perspective, and a fan's perspective is very important too, because if you make if you make a song just for musicians, you're going to starve to death. So what I'm saying is it'd be great to have the depth of understanding of a match the way I do music, but having that fan perspective, I think, makes it helpful for me to do what I do with hosting podcasts and the like.
Perfect. Which, speaking of hosting podcasts, how did you? So the idea of why it ended, where did that come from, and how did you get hooked up with Robbie E being kind of your co-host on it?
Okay, well, I've never told the story before, so I'm going to tell the story for you. So, first of all,
Yeah.
there's a person out there who's super mean to me all the time. He's just mean, but he's really not. And his name's Conrad Thompson. Okay, so Conrad is someone I worked really, really, really closely with over the last year. And to his words, he said, I was in a podcast internship. Now, Conrad is the smartest guy I've ever known. So I didn't realize, I don't know what, he's grooming me or whatever the hell, right? So I get a phone call from Terry Runnels out of the blue. I hadn't hosted a podcast. I hadn't interviewed anybody. I've just been engineering. And so Terry Runnels, I started her podcast. Now, she's a really nice person, and I really like her a lot. And since working with her, she's done some nice things for me and my son. But it didn't work out. But on the last show, she made me mad because I wrote out a format. When you do these podcasts, the bad ones I think don't prep, and the good ones do. So I follow Conrad's example, and I make a nice format. I send it to her. She approves it. That's what we're going to talk about. All that stuff's going to be a good show. She calls me like the day of and like, we're going to interview Robbie E today. Now, I didn't really care about Robbie E. I knew who Robbie E was. Not only did I not want to interview, but I couldn't possibly see what this wrestler could bring, except the fact they were doing a show together in England like in a week. But Robbie got on the air, and he was fantastic. You know, I mean, you've heard him on Why It Ended. Like, he's a very engaging personality, right?
Yeah, absolutely. He's very, like, I knew him from kind of Impact Wrestling a little bit, like you said, but since your podcast has really taken off, I'm like, man, this guy is awesome. Why is he not, you know, bigger in the sense of why is he not with, you know, WWE or something of that nature?
So exactly, and I did not really know Robbie's work, except I'd seen a couple of his matches, and I knew who he was, you know. And so he was just so good on the show. He really saved the show because Terry and I were like not happy with each other. It was my last show, I think, and we just like had it out like on the air. It was pretty awkward. And Robbie saved it, and it was a decent show because of Robbie. And I guess 2 weeks go by, and I get a DM from him, and he goes, "I want to pitch you a idea for a podcast." Now, mind you, at the time, I was working with Medusa and Dutch Mantel. I was producing the Pritchard Show and the Shivani Show, and I was hosting a show with Johnny Fairplay. And then I was about to start working on 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff. So, and because, you know, that show had been in the planning stages for a while. So, I'm like, dude, okay, well, I'm open to any opportunity. Like someone, you know, who am I? You know, I know I'm not going to take it, but whatever. And so he gives me a call, and he pitches me, despite what Zack Ryder says, despite what EC3 says, it's totally his idea. He pitches me, and I had no desire to do another podcast. I didn't know if I could possibly do it with Robbie E. And in talking to him and his concept, I was like, oh my God, this is great. You know, this is go ahead.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It's kind of like when I started with this, I kind of took the Conrad school of thought, and what you guys are doing is making it a unique, different kind of podcast. Because there's so many podcasts out there that review the current day product that I think that what you guys are doing is so unique. It's such a great, entertaining listen.
Well, let's be real about it. You know, Colt Cabana, right? Colt Cabana interviewed people and was good at it. Steve Austin interviewed people and was absolutely fantastic at it, right? So then everybody had the interview model, you know, a guest a week. The Ric Flair show with Conrad had an interview model, guest a week, even though it had Ric Flair. So Conrad invented, I would call it the Conrad model, you know, which is you take one person, you take one small subject, you make an entire show about it, you make the show very interactive, very fan friendly, and the host, Conrad, is kind of an equal to the star and is able to confront him about stuff, and it's the Conrad model. And so now that took off, and no one can copy it really except Conrad, although I've tried. So he's done the same kind of model with Shivani and Eric, but that model is being copied by everybody now. So you need something different. So Robbie's idea was, hey, you know these people who are on TV and they disappear, and you want to know what happened to them, but you don't want to know what happened as much as why it happened, when it ended, how did their dreams go, how did they feel, and he's really just not pitching me an attempt to make money, not pitching me an attempt to have a great podcast, just pitching me this great idea. So I just thought it was fantastic. So I get off the phone. I remember where I was. I was in the parking lot waiting to go into Chipotle because I like Chipotle. And
dude,
I'm
best friend.
oh man, they know me there. It's terrible. So I'm in the parking lot of Chipotle. I'm supposed to be eating by now, but I've talked to Robbie for 20 minutes. I text Conrad. I think we're in a group chat. I group chatted Conrad, and Conrad writes just back. He wrote, "Fuck yes." That's exactly what he wrote. Capital letters. You know, like if I go to Conrad and I go, "Hey, Robbie pitched me this idea," he would be dubious and he would shit on it. He'd be like, "Matt, you're being a fucking idiot." Or, you know, as he did, he said, "This is it, dude. Go for it. Go for it." You know, so I've gone for it. And, you know, we do a lot of prep. We do a lot of editing. For instance, our first show, Glacier, he talked for like 2 hours and 15 minutes and we edited it down to 45 minutes. So I do a lot of prep. We have Robbie as he comes. And another good thing about the show is, say we're interviewing, I don't know, any wrestler, D'Lo Brown, right? Robbie's a worker. Robbie's a wrestler. So it's easier for them to pull the curtain back with Robbie there than if it was just me. At the same time, Robbie's not going to ask him, like, you know, "Hey, did RVD have the chair in his hands when he did the total elimination?" So, you know, you have the fan perspective. So I think it works well because we do a lot of prep. We have a wrestler asking questions as well as a fan asking questions. And we do a lot of editing to make it as entertaining as possible for the fans.
You really do. I mean, I learned a ton of. I mean, I'm like you, just a wrestling fan. I'm a wrestling nut, but I learned a ton of stuff from the Marty episode, the Glacier, all of them that I never knew about them, and I thought I knew a lot.
Well, here's the thing is I'm a fan like you, right? So I'm in my 40s. So I've been a fan since Hulk Hogan. I'd say Hulk Hogan and Arn Anderson were like my first two guys, right? You know, so I'm literally wanting to know things about Glacier. Glacier, I'm like, dude, why in the hell did you guys have this big ad campaign on and you guys disappeared? And he's like, "Well, it's the NWO, you know." And then I asked Eric Bischoff that in person like a couple weekends ago, and he's like, "I don't even remember, dude." But Glacier gives me the answers, and you know that's not something anybody would ask but a fan. So I try to keep those fan questions in mind because we have to remember, as podcasters, our audience, number one, wants to be entertained in a very competitive market, and number two, we need to make the effort to entertain them and not just indulge ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you guys are definitely one of the hottest growing podcasts because I jumped right on it right from the Glacier episode, and I was like, man, this is just a really unique concept because I've always thought about like, yo, what happened to Glacier? What happened to Muhammad Hassan? It's great, really a great concept.
And, you know, the concept has expanded a little bit with someone like Simon Gotch. His wrestling career hasn't ended. So it's why the WWE ended, you know. With Marty Jannetty, it's why it ended 7 times, you know. And it means different things for different wrestlers. But what it is that we try to get their dream of being a wrestler. We try to find out how they hooked up and how that led to their dream. Their heights, the living the life, you know, what was it like when they were, you know, at the very top? And then what were the signs when it started to go down? And then why it ended, how it ended, who talked to them, you know, and then meanwhile, any interesting stories in between, like with Marty Jannetty, I wanted to know about Chuck Austin. You know, I wanted to know about them pushing Sean instead of him and telling you that to his face. So, you know, we do a lot of work on it, you know, and Robbie and I have a briefing before every time, and we text back and forth during the interviews to try to get the best out of our guests as well.
Yeah, I mean, probably my favorite so far, though, has been the Buff Bagwell. That was a great episode. It had me thoroughly entertained and laughing.
Yeah, you know, Buff had some great stories, and I work off a timeline. You know, it's just like Conrad stuff, where I start at the beginning of their career and move along, and if the show kind of stalls, I'll just move on to the next part of their career. And Buff Bagwell was someone who talked a lot, went off in tangents a little bit, and went off in different stories. So the timeline wasn't as firm, but there were a couple stories that we had to keep in there. So I want to say that Buff talked for about an hour and a half, and then we clipped it down to about 50 minutes, 45, 50 minutes. But we got the story of him telling his wife that he'll be having sex with somebody on Showtime in 2 weeks, which I think is the greatest line ever. We got the story of him. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, that was the best. I had to step out. Luckily, it was break time at work, so I took a step out because I was laughing listening to that.
I died. I just sat here, and died. And then there's one part when, we asked, so, real serious, cause I'm like, so Buff, looking back on it, why did it end? And he said, computers. And so there's like 3 seconds of silence and I'm just like, why is that? Like, I didn't get it. And every time I hear it, I just get a giggle out of it. And then, of course, the story of him shooting his dad with his gun, to close the show out. And, we had talked to him maybe 2.5, 3 hours. And I think I was due to be on Wade Keller that night. So I had to watch Raw and I was like 45 minutes behind. So I had to edit it because the first edit was like Buff going, so then I shot my dad in the chest and I said, you bastard, I hope you die. And then I say, all right, so Buff Bagwell said everything all this week and, I just moved it on. But, we have to do some editing sometimes to make it work for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, that was great. The dad in the chest, telling his wife he's going to have sex with somebody on Showtime. It was really good, but it was also, interesting to hear his perspective and these guys that you're getting their perspective on why something ended, like Simon Gotch, who was like, I was so burnt out. And you would think someone like that would be happy being in WWE.
Well, here's the thing is that wrestlers are people, right? So like when you meet these people and a couple of these, I'm not going to say any names, but a couple of these wrestlers I've gotten close to where I talk to them kind of frequently, and they have problems like everybody else has. And so they're going to have situations like everybody else has. We, a lot of times, just don't know shit as fans. Like we know what the Observer tells us, which I'm a big fan, or what Wade tells us on Pro Wrestling Torch, and what we hear and those rumors we hear, but we really don't know anything except from what we hear from these guys. So when we get a Simon Gotch on and he tells us the deal, we can almost kind of understand it. We can almost say, okay, dude, I totally get why you didn't want to work there, but it's hard if you're not on the inside to understand it.
Absolutely. Well, another kind of, as I look at my notes that brings that, you bring up a good point because you were on Wade Keller's podcast reviewing Raw. I know for me, as I got older, I wanted to get into the business side and know more about pro wrestling. When was that the same with you? As you got older, you're like, I want to know more of the backstage stuff.
Well, I have an advantage that a lot of people don't have. I have a 15-year-old son who loves wrestling, right? So I watched it when I was a kid, and then I got divorced. And then, no, I didn't. I mean, that wasn't the exact sequence of events. I watched it when I was a kid. I grew up. I got married. Then I got divorced. And so then I had a 9-year-old, 10-year-old kid who's a wrestling freak. And I said, what are we going to start doing? I said, well, let's start going to WrestleManias. So we've been to 5 in a row. I've gotten much more involved. And to your point about being on Wade Keller, we used to listen to Wade Keller and Bruce Mitchell, who's actually become a friend of mine. Every day we listen to them all the time. And about a year and a half ago, I was feeling a little listless. I was dating somebody and I said, I'm going to do something in the wrestling business, and she's like, what do you mean? I go, I don't know. I'm going to do something. And the fact that now I'm at a level of quote unquote knowledge and credibility where a Wade Keller will have me on to talk wrestling, or a Jason Powell will have me on to talk wrestling, or even a Nick's Rock and Wrestling podcast will have me on to talk wrestling. It's amazing to me. So I still try to learn as much as I can. And I also try to go with the trends, like I don't hate Roman because everybody hates Roman. I don't think Braun is the best because everybody thinks Braun is the best. I try to keep an independent mind. So I have a decent viewpoint when I go on these shows.
Absolutely. And that was kind of what I want to talk about since you went on Wade Keller's, kind of your thoughts on the current product. And that brings me to an interesting point, especially because you were into it as a kid, but then you had your own kid and kind of got back into it compared to me, where I've been 29 years of just straight. I've watched it. It's been a part of my life. So what have you noticed, obviously, differences of when you're a kid now watching your 15-year-old son get into wrestling?
Okay, so don't get me wrong. I didn't really get out of touch with the product, but, so I've been watching pretty much straight for the last decades. But for me, the product now, it's very different, right? It's very homogenized. When you're talking product, we didn't used to say products. We used to say wrestling, but now we say product because we're just talking about one company. We're talking about the WWE. I think that it's a lot of stuff for kids. Like, it's always been for kids. we might not dig, Roman Reigns, but the kids like Roman Reigns. We definitely don't dig John Cena, but the kids dig John Cena until John Cena becomes a good enough wrestler where we start to approve of him. All in all, I'm not one of these guys who says wrestling is worse than it used to be. I think that's old people talk. I think it's the same thing as old people coming downstairs when Elvis was on the record and going, turn that shit off, or when the Beatles were on, turn that shit off, or Led Zeppelin, turn that shit off. I'm sure the same thing happened with Bruno Sammartino when someone said, dude, who's this big guy, dude? He's not a technical guy, or see Hulk Hogan and say Hulk Hogan can't wrestle, or see Stone Cold Steve Austin or The Rock and say, God, these guys are not credible at all. And now we see a guy like Roman Reigns who, by our paradigm, should be booed, should be a bad guy, and by the paradigm created for him should be cheered. But we can't understand that. We go, what the fuck is it with this guy? But really, it's just another in a long line of old people not understanding what's going on.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. Contrary to you saying you don't boo Roman, I don't necessarily boo him. I just think that there needs to be a defined character there, because I grew up in the Attitude Era where you had Stone Cold, you had The Rock, you had Undertaker, you had these guys where you could describe their character in 15 seconds to somebody that wasn't a wrestling fan.
Well, it's true, like an elevator pitch. So that's my argument for Roman, okay? Because it's like I said on Wade. I said this on Wade Keller podcast, and then Jimmy Jacobs said pretty much the same thing, which will be on Why It Ended this week. And that is, okay, you're going to get rid of Roman. Vince has to have a top guy. Good guy, bad guy, he doesn't care. Vince has to have a top guy. So who replaces him? Okay, so is it Seth Rollins? Who's Seth Rollins? What is Seth Rollins? And can you describe, Seth Rollins in a 10-second elevator ride, in between floors? Can you tell your friend what a Seth Rollins is? Braun Strowman, what is a Braun Strowman? He's big, but why does he do what he does? With Roman, we actually have someone who we kind of have the answers to those questions. So the question becomes, if it's not Roman, who replaces him?
Yeah, absolutely. That's always been kind of my thing. Is it's hard now to describe characters. I almost want to say that I've had this discussion with my older brother, who's also a huge wrestling fan. Is it seems like you had your Hulk Hogan's, your Ultimate Warriors, Undertakers that grew out and became these superstars, but in the reverse effect, nowadays it's the brand that sells it. You go to see WWE, you don't just go to see one person.
Not only that, you don't only go to see any person. You go to see the WWE. You go to see WrestleMania. There's nobody above the marquee. And to even a greater extent, we don't really care who wins the matches. We just want to see a good match. So that's something that's changed a lot. We, as fans, are not invested as to who wins or who loses. That doesn't bother us at all. It's about whether we see a good match or not. I saw Nakamura Sami Zayn in person. So, at NXT. So I know that was a great match. Now that I think about it, I remember that Nakamura wins, but it's not the enduring memory. So I think that's one of the evolutions that take place. Not only that, the brand is above the person. Bruce Mitchell calls it the mid-card era because nobody's a main eventer. All we have are mid-carders. But as a company running a business trying to make money, why not emphasize your brand over the people working under your brand?
Absolutely. It's fascinating as I've grown up so much different. This is a brand. When I was younger, it was, I'm going to see Stone Cold. Now it's like, I'm just going to WWE.
Well, the one thing that hasn't changed is that, the art of wrestling is, as someone once said, separating the fan from their money, right? So that's all it is. Even though we don't have the biggest, and this is just straight from Conrad, even though we don't have the biggest audience we've ever had, we have a much more invested fan base. It's a lot like podcasts. We might not have the largest audience in the world, but we have an invested audience that will buy an engaged audience that will buy our T-shirts, that will tweet our stuff, that will stay engaged with us. And the WWE fan is spending more money. They're more like me, where I've been to 5 WrestleManias, I've been to 3 SummerSlams. I go there and I see a bunch of dudes just like me who are there spending way more money than the people did 20 years ago on wrestling.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, how much you can interact with your favorite wrestlers is different. You can go on Twitter and tweet a picture of me and Chris Jericho at his Fozzy show, and he'll retweet me and say thanks for coming. You couldn't have done that 20 years ago.
And that's an important point. The wrestlers who do that well do themselves a lot of favors. The wrestlers who don't do that well don't do themselves a lot of favors. Look at what Cody Rhodes has done with Twitter. So I take it back to what I think might be the most brilliant marketing Twitter social media point in the history of Twitter, which is Cody Rhodes leaves WWE as fucking Stardust, and then he makes a list. He makes a list and takes a picture of that list of the people he's going to wrestle. And in that moment, he made it where it's not Stardust getting released. It's look at all these matches that Cody can have now, and look at how it's going to take him outside of his zone that we see him as, and look how much we're looking forward to it now. And that was the very beginning. And since then, Cody has run a perfect, he's run 100%. He's batting 1,000 on social media, and it just keeps leading to great things. On the other hand, you have the Roseannes of the world, or, you know, the Disco Infernos of the world, or the Vince Russos of the world, who only damage their brand with tweeting and the like.
Absolutely. Speaking of Cody Rhodes and Chicago and All In, you're going to be there for Starrcast. What are you going to be, some of the things you're going to be doing there for Starrcast?
So, okay. So I'm known for doing a lot of stuff. Like Conrad's known as being the hardest working guy in podcasting. I'd say that he would agree I work pretty hard as well. So Starrcast is something I've been involved with since kind of the very beginning, since before it was Starrcast. Conrad's idea, and a lot of people around him who helped him implement it, but it's 100% Conrad as far as the conception and the work behind it. What I'll be doing is, number one, I'm going to be hanging out and bringing out a guy by the name of Brian Pillman Jr., and we're going to be doing some signings with Brian. Number two, I'm going to be there with Robbie E. and a couple people for Why It Ended. We're going to be doing a live panel show with guests that we're bringing in, so they will be announced. But just some of the guests we've had, some of the most outrageous guests we have, we're going to have a panel with those people. I might be doing something really special with Dutch Mantell. We're going to see if Dutch makes the trip. If Dutch makes the trip, we got something really special involving Bruiser Brody. That's going to be cool. And then the thing I'm most excited about is, if you're familiar with Being the Elite, the video show that, you know, Cody and them put out, the Young Bucks' dad, Matt Papa Buck Massey, has made these songs, and so I'm going to help bring them to life. And it's going to be me on guitar, a guy named Dylan Spears, who has actually done some remixes of the songs that have been through on Being the Elite. The drummer's going to be my son. And then on bass, we're going to have a guy by the name of Frankie Kazarian, and we're going to be doing all the Being the Elite songs at a live concert.
Wow, that'll be a blast. I'm definitely going to make sure I'm there for that, because I'm on Podcast Row, so I'm going to make sure that if I'm even podcasting, I run over and catch that.
And that's one of the genius things about Starrcast. So Starrcast is an experience. Like, Conrad has been a fan for a long time, who's traveled to a lot of events, so he's been to a lot of conventions. I know that the one thing he doesn't necessarily love going to, and that he didn't want to have, was a convention. He wanted an experience. So everything that's going on at Starrcast is an experience. It's not just, you know, having people sign autographs. It's being able to touch these ring-worn belts, or wear the Ric Flair robe, or see a panel with the NWO, or see a panel on the death of WCW, or see a Why It Ended panel. It's going to be one of the most interactive things ever. And at the same time, it's centered around podcasts, because that's what Conrad does. And you have him wanting to include podcasts that might not necessarily be included on these things, maybe like your podcast, and maybe give you a chance to have a bigger platform, to make some contacts, to get some interviews, to get some experience, to really take in the whole thing and really go to the learning tree and see how you can make your thing as good, maybe, as his things.
Well, that was what drew me right to it, man. When I found out that I could sign up at the Podcast Row, I was like, absolutely, this is huge. I mean, the fact that I'm going to be there and, you know, have a chance to interview whoever of the announced guests is major, like, just, you know, promotion in itself.
It's crazy if you think about it, because you have Podcast Row and you have all this stuff going on, all these things. So, you know, Starrcast, you know, is with Conrad and the other people involved in Starrcast are flying out all these people. They've rented the hotel. They're making this the best event of all time. So there is no reason for them to include a Podcast Row except to kind of pay it forward a little bit. And I just think when he came up with that idea, it was a brilliant idea just to involve more people. If you look at the way the man tweets and the way that he talks about other podcasts, we're all one big family. We're in competition, but we're not in competition. You know, there's no reason not to help each other out if we're confident in the job that we're doing.
Yeah, definitely. That's what's been so great talking to Conrad last week and yourself this week is you guys have been very personable and approachable. It hasn't been like, oh, I'm doing my own thing, I'm too big. You guys have been very approachable and helpful.
And here's the thing, you know, I interviewed Jimmy Jacobs, right? Jimmy Jacobs talked about Eddie Guerrero. His first match in WWE as a extra was, and don't say jobber. This is these things you learn. You don't say the word fake ever, and you don't say the word jobber ever because they're not for us to say. But, you know, Jimmy Jacobs was an extra, and he worked with Eddie Guerrero. Eddie came to him and apologized to him and said, I'm sorry, this has got to be all about me, blah, 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 because he's supposed to lose the match, you know, pretty swiftly. And it's a great example of how to be with someone who's coming up. Conrad has been nothing but encouraging to me, and he's also encouraging to all the other podcasters out there because he's trying to see this whole thing grow. He's not just trying to see his own thing grow. And at the same time, it behooves us business-wise to reach out to everybody and to make ourselves available. I was at Conrad's house, and I saw him doing interviews with podcasts that have, you know, 300 Twitter followers just to do it, just to give back and just to make himself available. And at the same time, how does that do him any harm at all?
Absolutely. That's kind of my take when I started this was I'm like, I'll do anybody, whoever I can just to pay it forward because Conrad, you know, was kind of my inspiration. I'm like, he's just a fan. I want to do this. And I meet great guys like yourself along the way. Yeah,
and I'll say this about Conrad, and maybe you can trademark this, but Conrad's just a fan, but he's a fan with a plan, you know? And he reminds me of myself in the sense that he gets inspired by ideas off the bat and be like, check this out. I'm going to do this. Check this out. I'm going to do a paid model for the Shivani show. You know, check this out. I'm going to work with Eric Bischoff. Check this out. I'm going to do this. A lot of these were just lightning bolts that hit him, you know, and then planning and planning and planning and planning and planning. And then executing that plan. I believe Starrcast was no different. So that's a good model we have to go off is that he's a fan, but he's a fan who works really hard and has a lot of vision and has a lot of foresight and self-awareness and isn't afraid to make improvements when he has to as well.
Absolutely. It's always progressing and improving, and I will say that. Another thing I really wanted, because I was looking at your guys' t-shirt today, the smooth chocolatey voice. I know where it came from, but could you tell my listeners where that came from?
Well, it's funny. It started with a guy who I gave a hard time to on Twitter a while ago because, you know, a few of us knew about the Bischoff thing, right? So we started kind of tweeting about it, you know, like a long time ago. Like if you go back on Twitter, I'm talking maybe 5-6 months ago, you'll find references to the word 83 from a few of us, you know. We'll be like, we'll tweet Bischoff and be like, wow, I haven't heard that story 83 times, you know. And so Nick Hausman, who, if you haven't checked out Nick Hausman's coverage of the CM Punk WWE Doctor trial, check it out. It's all on WrestleZone.com. Nick Hausman was Bischoff's old podcast host. So I might have said something crappy to him and then he blocked me. And then maybe 6 months later, he's interviewing Robbie E. about why it ended. He's like, man, your co-host has this silky, chocolatey voice. And then that's when I reached out on Twitter and said, look, I said something crappy and you blocked me, you know, but you said something nice about me. So now Nick and I are super cool. And actually he's hosting a documentary series on wrestling. I think it's called Wrestling Road Stories that I'm doing the music on and working on the same project with. So it came from Nick Hausman, and you should definitely support him at WrestleZone.com and give him a follow at WZ Rebel.
Awesome. Well, definitely we'll do that. So you run your own kind of music school, and then I know on Something to Wrestle With, it has happened a couple of times, you kind of have a donation that people can do because you want everyone to be able to take lessons even if they can't afford it.
Well, that was a program I did last year, and I still do it in a different way. But what I did, and it's something that someone like Conrad, who's a good businessman, helped me out with, is like, dude, he says at First Family Mortgage, if you need a mortgage, you go to Conrad. At First Family Mortgage, they do charity work, but they make sure they have the money first. So what I did was I paid out of my pocket for all these kids to either take free lessons at Mako Music, which is my place, or go to a camp. And so then I was going to start a charity, a GoFundMe to recoup that money, as a fundraiser. And I eventually did, but I'm not doing that this year. But if you want to check out my music school, or I'm starting to do Skype lessons. Like I said, I've been trained by the best in the world, and I'm endorsed by the Berklee School of Music and members of the Dave Matthews Band, members of the Steve Miller Band, members of the Aaron Neville Band, Bela Fleck and the Flecktones. You can check me out on Twitter at Matt Koon Music, and I'm going to be starting to do some Skype lessons on all instruments.
Awesome, that looks really good. So where can everybody find Why It Ended?
So Why It Ended is one of the podcasts I do. I don't want to leave out another podcast I do on Survivor. If you watch Survivor with Johnny Fairplay, and it's called Survivor NSFW. I also do. Man, Johnny's gonna be so pissed off at me. Sorry, Johnny. We have a new podcast called The Botch Along, where Johnny and I and a special guest watch a WWE or network special, and we just talk crap during it. And we have a special guest each time. 2 shows ago it was Bruce Mitchell. Last week it was the Hurricane, Shane Helms. So you can check that out at Botchalong or botchalong.com. But for Why It Ended, you can go to whyitended.com and you can listen, or mlwradio.com. We're available on iTunes. On Twitter, you can find us at Why It Ended. And make sure to keep your eye open for a guy named the Robert Strauss Brand, because I believe Robbie E. might be dead, and we have a new arrival with the Robert Strauss Brand.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to the future Why It Ended. I'm looking forward to seeing you guys do your music at Starrcast. Matt, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join me.
No, thanks a lot. It's an honor to be on, and I enjoy the show. I'm going to listen to it some more, and I appreciate being on, man. Thanks a lot. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you to Matt Koon for joining me today. Great conversation. And that's what, like I said at the beginning of the episode, just 2 guys talking music, talking wrestling. Very cool dude. If you have not, go check out Why It Ended. It is great podcast. I support all podcasts, whether it be music, rock talk, and music talk, or wrestling, but it is really good concept, and it's really enjoyable. It was cool to hear some of the behind the scenes kind of interviews on how they got started and some of the stories along with Buff and Glacier, all of that. So it's very good stuff. So definitely go check it out. It drops every Wednesday just like this. So maybe we're getting a little Wednesday podcast wars going with those guys. So definitely go do that. Make sure you give Matt a follow on Twitter at Matt Koon Music. Make sure you give the podcast a follow as well at Nick's R&W Podcast on Twitter, Instagram Rock and Wrestling Podcast, Facebook Nick's Rock and Wrestling Podcast. Find us on YouTube, Google Play, Stitcher, iTunes Radio, all basic podcasts apps out there. We're getting on all of them now. Still on SoundCloud, iTunes. Make sure you go over to iTunes, give the podcast a 5-star review, and screenshot it. Message me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Rock and Wrestling Podcast at gmail.com. I'll hook you up with a free t-shirt. I will definitely do that. Make sure as well you go over to Pro Wrestling Tees and get your official Rock and Wrestling Podcast t-shirts. I'm going to have some new designs coming up there in the next couple of weeks, next couple of months. Going to get some more up there, so definitely go over to ProWrestlingTees.com, Rock and Wrestling Podcast store, and get yourself a hookup there. I'll give you a shout out on the podcast when you do buy a shirt. So make sure you also go to patreon.com/RW Podcast, and you can see the different tiers, and you can get some sweet deals over there, some more interactive stuffs, and you can help kind of sponsor the podcast and get things rock and rolling. So, as I mentioned at the top of the show, got our schedule coming up for the next month or so. I want to thank Matt Koon for coming on again. I want to thank everybody that supports the podcast. If you're a new listener, I thank you. I hope you're enjoying the format I've got here. A little bit of rock talk, a little bit of wrestling. So definitely interact with me on Twitter, all of that. Money in the Bank is going to be coming up here in about a week from Sunday. So you want to talk that, feel free to shoot me on any of the social media, and definitely we'll talk all about that. So but that's going to be it for this week's episode. Make sure you follow Matt Koon. Make sure you follow Rock and Wrestling Podcast on Twitter, Nick's R&W Podcast, all that good stuff. And I will see you right here, same time, same bat channel, right here on the Rock and Wrestling Podcast. See ya next week.